Okay, lovely to have you back with me today, Year 12. We're still on the topic of gender. It's our lesson number 15. We're on week 10. Okay, I'm definitely getting twitchy. I haven't been so long without going to work. But I'm really pleased to see that you're watching the videos and that you're checking in. And again, when we meet face to face, we'll be able to look at those essays that you're working on for me together, and just to iron out what makes this process, or what could make this process easier, more efficient for you. Anyway, on with today's lesson. So we're looking at gender, and we're looking to establish knowledge and understanding of the concepts relating to gender and how it impacts on language. So here's our quick little starter. What D's complete each definition? So I almost feel like I'm in a bingo hall. Give me a D for women's language that fails or suffers from shortcomings. What D is used is the concept for when women and men use language differently. And what D is used to describe the fact that men potentially could use language to maintain power. And what's the final D, where men and women really use language in the same way. Okay, so just as a quick little warm up, write down your D's. And let's have a look then. So what D describes women's language as failing or suffering from shortcomings, particularly in comparison to men? It is the D of deficit. Brilliant. Which D is conceptually linked to the idea that women and men use language differently? What could it possibly be? Difference. Concept of difference. So we've got the concept of deficit, the concept of difference, and over here, representing for the men on this side, men using language to maintain power, or patriarchy over women. What D have we got? Brilliant. We have the D of dominance. And this last one's really important. It always kind of almost fails to capture people's imagination as much as the other three. But this is where you get your A grade, by really appreciating this argument that comes under this concept. So what's the final D? Good. It's actually the phrase, isn't it? Difference is a myth. That men and women really use language in the same way. Now, it is a really important concept to engage with, that one, and it's always the one that is the marker of the A grade student's response, that they can appreciate, yep, these other D's exist, these are the theories that support them. However, we want to be adopting maybe a more progressive, might be a good choice of word, understanding of gender, and that's really those differences are a myth, reinforced by society and cultural expectation, rather than really being about the language of the level of language. Okay, so those are our D's. Right, another little starter. So I've just completed some of those topic sentences, imagining I was a really good student yesterday. I am a people pleaser. I would have always done whatever my teacher asked of me. So I've completed my statements, but the question is, am I wrong or am I right? Are these statements true or are these false? So Robin Lakoff was working in the 1980s. You've got to just decide true or false. And what would you, if it was false, what would you correct it to? So, is that true or false? Okay, number 2, Lakoff is a significant theorist because she was the first to recognize the importance of studying the relationship between language and gender. So, is that true or false? Using observations, Lakoff focused on the language and behavior of men and women at work. Is that true or false? Her findings were published in a book called Language and Women's Place. True or false? And last but not least, the 1970s were a time of rapid change, tension and redefinition. The decade was a continuation of the 1960s, with women and other marginalised people fighting for equality. So, which of those are true? Which of those are false? Let's have a little look at the answers. Okay, so Robin Lakoff was working in the 1980s. No, we're a decade late there. She was working in the 70s. Her work did continue. She continued to have an established career. She continued to work through into the 80s and beyond. But her primary decade for really doing the work that gets her the recognition was the 1970s. Okay, now remembering dates is important. Okay, creation of flashcards is so key to your success. And don't avoid or ignore the dates, okay? 1980s, 1970s. Okay, Lakoff is a significant theorist because she was the first to recognize the importance of studying the relationship between language and gender. That one is true, absolutely. She was the first to kind of seriously acknowledge that this was an area worthy of study. Now, we could argue that was because of the climate she was working within. The 1970s was this period of change, and therefore people were naturally interested in anything that was being impacted by those waves of transition, those waves of progress, those tensions within society as it was changing. And she kind of recognized this relationship between language and gender. And in particular, if you like, language and society. We've seen that with the social theorists, yeah? There was a recognition of relationship between language and society. Okay, using observations, lack of focus on the language and behavior of men and women at work. False. Her primary focus, it was observations and it was at work, but women. So by default, a lot of the things when she compares the language of women to men, you could say, well, again, if we were being evaluative, if we were looking to challenge some of her ideas, but she didn't primarily focus on men. So really, by looking only at one gender at play, you could argue that her conclusions are only really valid for that gender, that without recognizing or acknowledging or observing men and how they behave, could she really make conclusions about male behavior? Maybe that's a point of evaluation, a point of challenge. Okay, but it was observations. So she did what we call in-field observation. She went to places of work. She observed women in conversation, in interactions in the workplace. Okay, and her findings were published in a book called Language and Women's Place, which is correct. Brilliant, that's the name of the book. And the 1970s, were they a time of rapid change, tension, and redefinition? Absolutely. The decade was a continuation of the 1960s, with women and other marginalized people fighting for equality. Now, it's a really tricky line because we want an appreciation of context. So what were the 1970s like? That gives us the context within which Lakoff was working, but also because there is a relationship between language and society, we need to know elements of, if you like, the zeitgeist, the feel of a society, its drives, its fears, but we don't need a historical kind of overview of everything that was happening. Okay, but so the 1970s, a time I could have said they're feminism. Okay, so you might have variation for that one. It doesn't make your answer wrong as long as we can prove that it relates to the 70s. So the 1970s were a time of feminism, with the redefinition of what it means to be female or to be a woman. We know, cycling back up to the top, that Robin Lakoff herself was a feminist. So she did have a particular set of ideologies and beliefs that she owned, that she was in ownership of. She said, I am a feminist, but they potentially might have made her biased. Okay? She was looking within the 70s to create a narrative, a story around women's language that said, you know, the treatment of women prior to this time has made them submissive, has submerged their identity, has forced women to be weak and deficit in the way they speak. You could argue that it suits her feminist ideology and belief, that she can create a narrative that says the reason women's language is weak and in a state of deficit is because of how society has mistreated them, how they have been misrepresented within society, how they have been marginalized. You know, a marginalized group means a group that are on the outskirts, a group that have been disempowered, a group that are not fully free to exercise what they want and how they want to do it. And she's saying that there's been an impact of that treatment of women on the way they use language. Because they feel weak, their language becomes weak. Because they've been silenced, their language is silent. Because they've been told women's things are trivial, their language becomes trivial. So actually, this is why these contexts are important. And just looking at that, each of those sentences becomes what we call that paragraph that would occupy the really strong C grade into B grade position. You're showing the beginning of detailed knowledge of theorists. The reason that wouldn't secure you higher than really probably top C is it's not an illustrated, it's not got any illustrated examples in there yet. Okay, and no challenge or evaluation for the A. So that's a really strong starting point for our theorists to be able to kind of do some sentences that contextualize them, when they were working, what they were doing, how they were credible, but we need a little bit more. Okay, so we're going to look today at a second theorist though. Okay, and we're going to be building knowledge of theory and concepts by introducing a second theorist today. And it says here that yes, gender can determine your use of language, with evidence suggesting that men and women will use language differently to communicate their needs and to get what they want. So gender can determine your use of language because men and women are using language differently. Remember, we said our simple beginning answer always wants to be a yes because, but then we're potentially going to leave to a but. So it says here we've got a series of utterances. They're utterances, not sentences, because they're taken from speech. Okay, being made by, are they men or women? So just reading through, you get to decide whether you think it sounds like a male or a female voice. Okay, so you can just say an M for male, F for female. Can you label the verbs? What patterns are you noticing as you look at the verb patterns? Can you label the pronouns? What patterns emerge? And could you think of a context? Could you think where these examples might be from? And is there anything about that context which could give us a but moment? Okay, men are doing this, women are doing that, but because of the context, it could be. Okay, my lovelies. So press pause, work through those activities around these language phrases, and we'll look at your answers together in a minute. Okay, so before we go for whether you think it's male or female, let's just have a look at the language levels at work here. So what colours have I gone for? So blue is our verb phrases, okay? So if we look at this first sentence, maybe what we ought to do is to stay with the dose. You are on. You can stay away. So we've got these quite expanded verb phrases. We're not using single verbs. So we've got the modal can with the main verb stay and the adverbial away. We've got the modal ought. Now, modals are helper verbs. There's a limited number of them, but they do affect meaning. So ought versus can. Maybe what we ought to do is to stay away. So rather than just say we ought to stay with the dose, stay with the dose, there's this what we call this hedge verb phrase. We ought to do is and can. And so can, again, is one of those modals that suggests choice. So this first one then, the patterns that we see in the first one is that we're using verb phrases, often coupled with modal verbs that present choice, okay, rather than being definite. If we're looking at this top one, what are the pronouns? Absolutely good. If you've got them, give them a tick. We. So immediately, maybe what we ought to do, so that sense of inclusivity. Yep, the speaker is including themselves with the person they're speaking to. But then there is a moment of direct kind of you and your. Yep, you. So the double pronoun you there. So there's an element of conversation with the emphasis then being put onto the listener in that one. Okay, now the next two don't have any pronouns, but they both begin with a verb. So what does that tell us? Great, that we are looking at imperatives. Lie down, take your shoes and socks off. So we've got two seemingly much more explicit or direct imperatives. Lie down, take your shoes and socks off. Let's look at this next one. Okay, well, let's make that our plan. Now, to let is a verb, an inclusive verb. Make is part of that verb phrase. What's hiding? What's that green pronoun that's hiding there? Do you know? Did you get it? Brilliant. Us. Well, let us make that our plan. So our and us are really inclusive pronoun choices. So it's that idea of first person plural. So whoever is speaking is very much looking to include themselves in not just the conversation, but the planning for the person they're speaking to. Sit for me right there. Okay, so we've got another pattern emerging. So here we've got a verb in the initial position, making it an imperative. Me is the singular, first person singular pronoun, object pronoun. Sit for me right there. So if you were thinking, which of the female and which of the male utterances do you think? Let's look at this last one and then we'll see. So let's stay on what we're doing. So we've got that. Now, it's always important to know that things sometimes hide in spoken language. We naturally use what we call contractions. Words are contracted. So that let's is really the contraction of let us stay. So that verb phrase with the inclusive object pronoun us and we inclusive pronoun. So we've got one speaker who is using verb phrases combined with modals of inclusivity. Okay, and modals that suggest choice and pronouns that suggest inclusivity. We're included, we're in this together, but you've got some choices. We've got one other speaker that seems quite different, using imperative verb forms and simply kind of being quite explicit, quite clear in telling somebody what to do. So it might be stereotypical, but which ones do you think would be female and which ones do you think would be male? Yeah. So our imperative, our explicit commands, lie down, take your shoes off, sit for me right there, are from a male. The other ones are from a female. Now, what context? Where do you think you might find yourself if somebody's asking you to lie down and take off your shoes and socks? Okay, let's quickly put that into some other context. What we ought to